Picture this. A war so colossal it bleeds across every map, stretching from the ice-blasted tundra of Alaska to the sweltering, malarial jungles of the South Pacific. The year is 1942, and America is a nation in motion, a titan stirring from its slumber. Millions of its sons' boys from Brooklyn, farmhands from Iowa, mechanics from California are being shipped off to places they would only just learn to find on a globe. They are the tip of the spear, the human engine of a war machine that must now function on a planetary scale. But there's a problem, a colossal fundamental oversight that threatens to stall this engine before it even truly starts. When these soldiers arrive on the shattered beaches of a captured island or a muddy field in rural England, what do they find? Nothing. There are no barracks waiting, no houses, not even a simple roof to shield them from the sky. There is only the raw, unforgiving planet, mud that sucks at their boots, relentless tropical rain that soaks them to the bone, and the elements beating down with impartial fury. How do you house an army of millions on the move? How do you keep them warm, dry, and healthy enough to fight? This was not a question of comfort. It was a question of survival that gnawed at the highest levels of command. The logistical nightmare was staggering. You can't just ship pre-built houses across oceans, patrolled by enemy submarines. You can't waste precious cargo space on mountains of lumber and nails, when every square foot is needed for bullets, beans, and gasoline. And you certainly can't spare the months it would take for skilled carpenters to build traditional barracks in a war zone, where the front line could shift miles in a single day. The military needed something radical, something that defied conventional construction. They needed a shelter that was fast, cheap, portable, and tough enough to endure a blizzard one month and a monsoon the next. This urgency was a ticking clock. A soldier shivering through a freezing European night or sweating with fever in a leaky Pacific tent is not just a man suffering. He is a weak link in the chain of war, a potential casualty before he ever sees combat. American planners knew this. They knew that the war would be won not just with heroic charges, but with superior logistics. They had to solve the shelter problem, and they had to solve it yesterday. And so, from the crucible of this impossible challenge, one of the strangest, most brilliant, and most overlooked solutions of the entire war was born. It was not a new tank or a faster plane. It was a building. A curved half-cylinder of corrugated steel that could be packed flat, shipped anywhere, and popped up like a metallic mushroom in a matter of hours. The Quonset Hut. Now, let me hit you with a number that is going to stick in your brain, a figure that illustrates the sheer scale of this revolution. During World War II, American factories produced more than 150,000 of these huts. That is not a typo. It was an industrial flood of steel and sweat, transformed into homes, hospitals, command centers, briefing rooms, and even chapels. Imagine being a young Marine in 1943, landing on a remote, jungle-choked island in the Pacific. One day you are sleeping in a foxhole. The next, you watch as a handful of Seabees armed with nothing but wrenches and hammers raise a steel structure out of the dirt, a building ready to house 40 men by nightfall. It must have felt like science fiction, a miracle of metal rising from the mud. But it was real, and it was the kind of gritty, practical ingenuity that would define the American war effort. The story of the Quonset Hut does not begin on a battlefield. It begins on a drafting table, born from the cold, hard calculus of military planning. In early 1941, months before the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor would plunge the nation into chaos, the U.S. Navy was already looking at the world map with a growing sense of dread. They saw a future that demanded a presence in every ocean, on every continent. To project that power, they needed bases, hundreds of them in places as diverse as the fog-shrouded Aleutian Islands and the coral atolls of the Pacific. But the traditional methods of construction were a liability. Bulky tents ripped and rotted in harsh climates, and wooden barracks were slow to build and a logistical nightmare to supply. The Navy needed a building that could be treated like a piece of military hardware, something you could box up, ship anywhere in the world, and have a crew of sailors bolt together with minimal tools and training. They needed a structure that could be erected in hours, not weeks, a shelter that was as mobile as the fleet itself. At the time, the U.S. military was not starting from scratch. They looked across the Atlantic to their British allies, who had been using a similar structure since the First World War, the Quonset Hut. Invented in 1916 by Major Peter Neeson, it was a revolutionary concept, a tunnel of corrugated iron on a steel frame that had sheltered millions of Tommies in the muddy fields of France. It was a proven design, but when American planners analyzed it, they saw room for improvement. The Quonset Hut, while effective, felt more like a construction project than a prefabricated kit. Its design often required more on-site work and was not perfectly suited for the kind of hyper-efficient mass production that American industry was gearing up for. They did not just want to adopt the Quonset Hut. They wanted to perfect it, to create a uniquely American version that was simpler, stronger, and could be produced at a speed the world had never seen. This is where a windswept peninsula in Rhode Island enters the story, Quonset Point. Here, at the newly established Davisville Naval Construction Battalion Center, the challenge was handed to a team of architects and engineers from the renowned George A. Fuller Company. The directive they received was straightforward on paper, but monumental in practice. Create a structure that was lightweight yet strong enough to deflect bombs and survive typhoons. It had to be cheap to produce, easy to ship, and simple enough for a handful of untrained men to assemble with basic hand tools. Above all, it had to be adaptable, capable of serving as a barracks in the Arctic cold or a field hospital in the tropical heat. The design they conceived was a stroke of pragmatic genius. They abandoned the multi-part ribs of the Quonset Hut in favor of simpler, stronger arches made from curved steel channels. The entire structure was designed around a system of interlocking parts, meaning the corrugated steel sheets fit perfectly onto the frame without the need for extensive on-site drilling or cutting. The interior was an open canvas, ready to be lined with masonite insulation, partitioned with plywood, and fitted with windows and doors at either end. The first prototype was constructed at Quonset Point in the middle of 1941, and it was from this location that the hut derived its now famous name. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant, but it was flawless in its function. A crew of 8 sailors, most of whom had never built anything in their lives, successfully erected the structure in a single day. The Navy commanders were ecstatic. This was the solution to one of their biggest logistical headaches. The Quonset Hut could be packed into a single crate, a complete building in a box weighing just a few tons, ready to be loaded onto a ship and sent to the farthest corners of the earth. The timing could not have been more critical. As the final design tweaks were being made and the first massive production orders were being signed, the world changed forever on December 7, 1941. With the nation now officially at war, the race was on. What had started as a clever solution to a housing problem had just become a vital component in America's strategy for global victory. The simple curved shell forged at Quonset Point was about to become one of the most recognizable symbols of the American military presence across the entire planet. Once the design was finalized at Quonset Point, the United States did not just decide to build Quonset Huts. It unleashed the full, earth-shaking power of its industrial might to churn them out in numbers that bordered on the unbelievable. This was not a construction project. It was mass production on a scale that mirrored the Liberty ships sliding from their docks and the Sherman tanks rolling out of Detroit. In the grand symphony of American wartime industry, the humble hut became one of its most prolific and essential instruments. By 1945, the final count of huts produced would exceed 150,000, a number so vast it is difficult to comprehend. It was enough steel and sweat to house entire armies, to build instant cities on barren landscapes, and to project American power into the most remote corners of the globe. How did they do it? The secret was the same formula that was winning the war on every front: standardization and the assembly line. Factories across the country, from Rhode Island to the Midwest, were retooled. Giant presses, once stamping out parts for automobiles or refrigerators, were now programmed to stamp, bend, and punch holes into sheets of corrugated steel with relentless, deafening precision. Every component was engineered to be identical. The genius was not just in the design of the hut itself, but in the design of the kit. Each hut was shipped as a self-contained package, a building in a box. Imagine a massive wooden crate weighing around 5 tons, being winched into the hold of a Liberty ship. Inside was not a pile of raw materials, but a perfectly organized set of components. There were the curved steel T-ribs that formed the skeleton, the stacks of pre-cut plywood for the end walls, the sheets of corrugated steel for the skin, rolls of masonite insulation, pre-assembled window frames, a door, a stovepipe chimney, and crucially, canvas bags filled with every last nut, bolt, and washer required. Tucked inside was a simple, diagram-heavy instruction manual, designed to be understood by anyone, regardless of their language or construction experience. The result was a process that was less like building and more like assembling a giant model kit. The real miracle was not just the production. It was the speed of erection in the field. A trained crew of 6 to 8 Seabees or Army engineers could have a Quonset hut framed, skinned, and ready for occupancy in less than a day. There was no need for heavy cranes, no demand for skilled carpenters, no waiting for a concrete foundation to cure if the ground was firm enough. Just manpower, a box of parts, and a few simple wrenches. This incredible speed was a strategic weapon. When American forces captured an island, they did not just win territory. They could transform it into a functioning base almost overnight. Airstrips that were nothing but packed coral one day could be lined with barracks for pilots, kitchens for mess halls, and offices for command staff by the end of the week. A bare patch of French countryside could sprout a field hospital in hours. This was the true power of the Quonset hut. It turned empty space into operational infrastructure at the speed of war. While German forces dug themselves into concrete bunkers and Japanese garrisons burrowed into elaborate cave systems, the Americans were building entire steel towns that seemed to rise from the earth as if by magic. The Quonset hut was more than a building. It was a symbol of an industrial philosophy that could outbuild, outsupply, and ultimately outlast any fortress its enemies could construct. Living inside a Quonset hut was an experience that seared itself into the memory of a generation. For millions of young American soldiers, many of whom had never been more than a few miles from their hometown, this curved shell of corrugated steel became their entire world. It was no luxury cabin, no cozy cottage. It was a machine for living in, as functional and unadorned as their own rifle. Yet, compared to the grim alternative, a waterlogged foxhole or a flimsy tent that collapsed in the wind, the Quonset hut was a palace. It was a tangible barrier against the chaos of war, a promise of a dry cot and a brief respite from the elements. The experience of life inside this steel womb varied dramatically depending on where in the world it was planted, but it was always intense, a full-body assault on the senses. In the vast furnace of the South Pacific, the hut was an oven. The tropical sun would beat down on the curved metal roof, and by midday, the air inside would become thick, heavy, and punishingly hot. Soldiers would describe the feeling of walking into one as being hit by a physical wall of heat. The steel skin would ping and groan as it expanded, and the air would be humid and still, smelling of damp earth, sweat, and mildew. Insulation and ventilation screens offered some relief, but the real enemy was the sound. When the afternoon deluges came, as they always did, the rain hammering on the corrugated roof was not a gentle pitter-patter. It was a deafening, continuous roar, like living inside a steel drum during a hailstorm. Conversations had to be shouted, and sleep was often impossible. It was a sound that became the unforgettable soundtrack to the war in the Pacific. In the colder climates of Alaska or Northern Europe during the winter of 1944, the hut presented the opposite challenge. It became an icebox. The same steel skin that trapped the sun's heat in the tropics seemed to invite the cold in, radiating a deep, penetrating chill that seeped into a soldier's bones. Condensation would form on the inside of the curved walls and freeze into a delicate layer of frost. The centerpiece of life in these frozen huts was the pot-belly stove, often one at each end, glowing cherry red. Men would huddle around it, a small island of warmth in a sea of cold, constantly rotating their damp socks and gear on improvised drying racks. The huts were loud, echoing chambers where a dropped canteen could wake the entire barracks, and the lack of privacy was absolute. You lived, slept, and breathed in the constant company of 40 other men, surrounded by their snores, their stories, and the smell of their fatigues. Yet, the true genius of the Quonset Hut was its chameleon-like ability to be whatever the military needed it to be. The same structure that served as a barracks for enlisted men could be transformed into a sterile field hospital, its interior painted white, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic, the echoing space filled with rows of cots holding the war's wounded. Elsewhere, a hut became a chapel, a crude wooden altar standing at one end, the curved roof amplifying the sound of hymns sung by weary soldiers thousands of miles from their hometown churches. It could be a bustling command post, its walls covered in maps and radio wires, or a mess hall filled with the clatter of metal trays and the boisterous energy of men lining up for a hot meal. It was a classroom, a supply depot, a movie theater for makeshift film nights, and a repair shop for jeeps. If it needed a roof, a Quonset Hut could provide it. For the soldier far from home, this simple structure offered a strange and vital sense of normalcy. It was a place to hang a pinup of a Hollywood star, to lay out your personal effects, to write a letter home, and to feel, at least for the night, that you were not completely at the mercy of the jungle or the desert. As one Marine stationed in the Pacific famously put it, "She ain't pretty, but she keeps the rain out." In the brutal calculus of war, that was more than enough. It was everything. The Quonset Hut did not merely stay in American training camps. Once production hit its stride, it spread across the globe like a steel tide, an unstoppable wave of infrastructure that followed the advance of U.S. forces wherever they went. From the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, these simple half-moon shelters became a ubiquitous feature of the World War II landscape. They were the physical embodiment of the American military's global reach. No matter how remote the location, no matter how hostile the environment, odds were that if you saw the American flag, you would soon see the familiar curved silhouette of a Quonset Hut rising against the horizon. In the Pacific Theater, the hut was not just useful. It was indispensable. The entire Allied island hopping strategy depended on the ability to turn captured atolls and jungle clearings into functioning air bases and supply depots with lightning speed. This was the specialty of the Naval Construction Battalions, the legendary Seabees. Right behind the first waves of Marines, the Seabees would land with their own equipment, and among the most important items in their inventory were the crated Quonset Hut kits. On an island like Guadalcanal, where torrential rain and rampant disease were as deadly as the enemy, the huts were lifesavers. Within days of securing a perimeter, the first steel arches would rise from the mud, creating dry barracks, clean kitchens, and protected medical stations. These instant buildings were the backbone that allowed the American war machine to establish a foothold, refuel its planes, tend to its wounded, and push ever closer to Japan. Entire cities of Quonset Huts, complete with roads and signs, bloomed on islands that had been untouched jungle just weeks before. In Europe, the challenge was different, but the solution was the same. After D-Day in June 1944, as Allied troops clawed their way into France, they moved through a landscape of shattered villages and destroyed infrastructure. The Quonset Huts followed. Perhaps the most astonishing deployments were in the world's most extreme climates, proving the design's profound adaptability. In the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, where hurricane-force Willowa winds could tear traditional buildings apart, the huts were anchored deep into the frozen ground with steel cables, their low, curved profile allowing the gales to scream harmlessly over them. In the scorching deserts of North Africa and the Middle East, their reflective steel roofs and optional insulation made them far more bearable than the canvas tents they replaced. By the war's end, the Quonset Hut had a staggering global footprint. It was a silent witness at supply depots in Britain, air bases in China, and naval stations in Australia. Through the Lend-Lease program, they even made their way to allies in the Soviet Union. This meant that a GI could be stationed on a French farmyard, a Pacific atoll, or an Arctic outpost, and find himself living in the exact same structure. It became a powerful symbol, proof that America had not just shipped its soldiers overseas. It had shipped an entire, portable civilization with them, ready to be unpacked and assembled wherever it was needed most. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in August of 1945, a strange and unprecedented problem arose. The colossal American war machine, which had been running at full throttle for years, began to grind to a halt. And with that came the question of its inventory. What was to be done with the endless surplus of jeeps, bombers, uniforms, and sea rations, and perhaps most awkwardly, what to do with the more than 150,000 Quonset huts standing sentinel on bases all over the world? These steel arches were designed to be temporary, a quick fix for the urgent crisis of war. Most people assumed they would be unbolted, melted down for scrap, and fade into history. But history had other plans. The Quonset Hut was about to begin its second, and perhaps most surprising, life not on the battlefield, but in the American backyard. The timing could not have been more perfect. As millions of GIs returned home, victorious and eager to start their lives, they collided with a severe domestic housing crisis. The nation that had just built a global war machine had neglected to build homes for its heroes. Construction had been on hold for years, and now, with a surge of new families being formed and the GI Bill sending a tidal wave of veterans to college, there was simply nowhere for them to live. Into this desperate gap stepped the humble Quonset Hut. The military, eager to offload its surplus, began selling the huts for as little as $1,000 apiece. Entrepreneurs, universities, and municipalities snapped them up. Suddenly, the symbol of war was poised to become a symbol of peacetime innovation. Across the United States, this led to one of the most unique architectural phenomena in the nation's history, the rise of the Quonset Village. On college campuses, from the University of Michigan to UCLA, entire communities of huts were erected to house student veterans and their young families. These neighborhoods, often affectionately nicknamed Vetsvilles or Fertile Acres, were a surreal sight. Rows upon rows of military-grade steel half-cylinders, sometimes painted in bright, cheerful colors to mask their drab origins. Inside, young couples partitioned the space into tiny living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms. They navigated the challenges of cooking in a curved room and learned to live with the constant metallic groans of the structure. It was not the suburban ideal they had dreamed of, but for a generation starting with nothing, it was a roof over their heads, a community of shared experience, and a vital stepping stone to the American dream. Beyond the universities, the Quonset Hut began to pepper the American landscape in countless other forms. Resourceful business owners bought them and, with a bit of ingenuity, transformed them into roadside diners, auto repair shops, and small-town movie theaters. Their distinctive curved shape became an accidental piece of iconic mid-century architecture. Farmers, recognizing a bargain when they saw one, found them to be perfect as barns, storage sheds, and livestock shelters. They're durable, all-steel construction impervious to rot and pests. Some were even converted into churches and community halls, their arched ceilings echoing with sermons and square dances instead of soldier snores. Of course, they were far from perfect. Families complained of the brutal summer heat and the bone-chilling winter cold. The lack of insulation remained a constant battle. But for a nation in transition, the Quonset Hut was a bridge, a tough, reliable, and affordable structure that carried an entire generation from the chaos of war to the promise of a new, peaceful prosperity. Even now, nearly 80 years after the end of World War II, the Quonset Hut has not vanished. While the great fleets of bombers have been grounded and the tanks have become silent statues in town squares, this humble steel shelter endures. You can still drive across the vast landscapes of the United States and spot them, half-cylinders of corrugated steel standing stubbornly in fields, tucked behind workshops, or lining the edges of forgotten airfields. Some are battered and cloaked in rust, their original purpose long faded. Others have been lovingly restored or repurposed, still serving a useful life. But all of them, whether derelict or dutiful, whisper the same powerful story: built fast, built cheap, and built to last far longer than anyone ever intended. The legacy of the Quonset Hut is far bigger than just nostalgia. It stands as a landmark in the history of architecture and design. Historians often point to it as a crucial forerunner to modern prefabricated housing. The revolutionary concept of shipping a complete, flat-packed building kit that could be assembled on-site by unskilled labor is something we now associate with global giants like IKEA. But in 1941, the American war machine was already perfecting this model on an industrial scale. The hut was a powerful proof of concept, demonstrating that modular, mass-produced design could be a practical and scalable solution to urgent housing needs, a lesson that continues to inspire today's architects and engineers working on emergency shelters and affordable housing solutions. It was the ultimate expression of the principle that form must follow function, a design stripped of all ego and ornamentation, leaving only a pure, strong, and honest structure. For the veterans of that era, the huts carry a profound emotional weight. They were the backdrop to their wartime lives, the steel womb where they wrote letters home, shared jokes with comrades, or simply collapsed into exhausted sleep after a battle. For civilians in the post-war years, they became a strange but familiar sight, a symbol not just of military power, but of the American capacity to improvise, adapt, and rebuild. This cultural resonance has cemented the Quonset Hut's status as an icon. Artists have painted its simple form against dramatic skies. Filmmakers have used it to instantly evoke the wartime setting, and writers have referenced it as shorthand for the grit and sacrifice of the greatest generation. In some small towns, community centers and legion halls housed within surplus Quonset Huts still stand, their curved roofs arching over a new generation, silent witnesses to the history that transpired within their walls. Most remarkably, the story is not over. In the 21st century, the Quonset form is experiencing a renaissance. A new wave of architects and DIY builders, drawn to its industrial chic aesthetic, its inherent strength, and its cost efficiency, have rediscovered its potential. Modernized Quonset-style kits are now being sold for everything from eco-friendly homes and minimalist cabins to workshops and art studios, proving that the brilliance of the original 1941 design never truly went out of style. Perhaps that is the most striking legacy of all. A structure that was meant to be temporary has, like the generation it sheltered, proven to be unexpectedly resilient. It is a marker of their struggle and their triumph, a steel monument still standing as a quiet testament to the war that reshaped the world. So the next time you see one of those curved steel shells by the side of the road, take a moment. Remember that the humble hut in front of you helped win a world war, housed soldiers on every continent, and went on to shape peacetime America in ways no one could have ever imagined. In its own quiet, unglamorous way, the Quonset Hut is as much a symbol of World War II as the Jeep, the Sherman tank, or the Liberty ship, proof that sometimes the simplest solutions cast the longest shadows.